Hey everybody, it's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. So I thought I would do this video because there's a lot of outrage about the OGL, the Open Game License, in case you don't know what it stands for, with this D&D thing with Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast, and I kind of remained silent on it. But since I kind of work in the industry, quote unquote, I do run some professional DMing gigs for particularly for kids, occasionally for adults, but mostly for kids. I run summer camps for RPG summer camps and spring break camps and winter camps and blah blah blah. After school classes that I kind of teach or run for Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of stuff. I teach acting classes, and occasionally I bring D&D into the acting classes to kind of teach some of the improv techniques, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, point is I kind of work in the industry, sort of. And so I figure I need to probably speak out on this, like a lot of the other people on YouTube and just in the industry in general, talking about what's going on with the OGL. So actually, I'm not going to really talk about that because I think enough has been said, and probably better than I would be able to say anyway. The only thing I could lend to that is I've been gaming since 1979 or 1980. I think it was 79 actually, so a long time ago. So I've been around way before the OGL thing. The first OGL came out in the third edition or 3.5 to be technical, and that allowed, it was an open game license that I'm standing for, that anybody could contribute to the product, right? It was an open game license. There were some rules you had to follow, some legalities you had to follow, as one would expect. But for the most part, content creators, game designers, etc., could make their own content. And using the SRD, which means Standard Rules Document, which is kind of the core rule system for Dungeons and Dragons, and then other games went on to kind of do that as well, like Pathfinder, and a few others as well. So, but what I want to talk about today was not specifically the OGL, even though I just kind of did for 2 minutes, but that's just kind of an opening statement. I wanted to talk about some alternatives to Dungeons and Dragons because now this new OGL thing, the 1.1 and now the 2.0 OGL that Wizards of the Coast recently released, has kind of ticked a lot of people off. I don't really. I'll just give you my little bit of opinion on that, and then we'll move on to the main thing of this video. So my take on that is, first of all, personally for me, it doesn't really affect me. I just run Dungeons and Dragons. I don't really create a lot of content for it. I do some, but I don't sell it. So it doesn't really affect me, right? It's only those designers who craft something that create content and they sell it on DM's Guild or in any other places, or they kickstart a project, and that affects them, right? Because they're making money directly by using Wizards of the Coast rules instead of creating their own rule system. So I actually have a game called Savage Kingdoms, which I'm sure many of you, well, not probably many people at all, but anybody that watches these videos, all 12 people, I guess, is this game system right here. So I don't have to worry about the OGL because this is my own game system. Now, I did have a couple of people write in, a couple of fans or whatever, or people that play the game, and they were like, "Oh, dude, are you going to be okay? It's Savage Kingdoms is going to be fine with the OGL," and it's so yeah. To answer that question briefly, yes, it's a totally different game system. It does use a D20, right? But Wizards of the Coast can't trademark a 20-sided dice. In fact, that 20-sided dice had been found all the way back to the Roman Empire. So yeah, so they can't even. But we will just laugh at them if they attempt to do something stupid like that. So it doesn't affect them. This is my own game system. I specifically created it to be different from D&D. The only reason I use a D20 is because a D20 is kind of familiar. It's kind of a symbol for tabletop role playing games. And my challenge to myself is to develop a game system that uses a D20, and that's all it uses. No D4s, no D6s, no D8s, no D10s, no D12s, etc. Nothing against those, but like I said, I run a lot of games for kids, and when they first come into or even new adults, when they first come into the hobby, the different dice are two things. Number one, they're very intriguing and entrancing and enthralling because all these different shapes and colors, and the dice nowadays are all funky and cool. But the other thing is they're very confusing. It's like, which dice do I roll now? Which die do I roll now? Or which set of dice do I roll now? Is this the D20 or D8 or the D10? All this kind of stuff. So the D20 system that I created, I shouldn't just call it a D20 system because that's actually a trademark. Capital D 20 is D&D's kind of system, they called it, but it's not really called that anymore. So I guess it's fine from like 3.5. But it is a D20 system, not the D20 system. Assuming that Wizards has coined that phrase. So yeah. So that's that. All that to say that my stance on OGL is doesn't affect me personally. Beyond that, I think it's a little heavy-handed. I think almost everyone agrees with that. I won't be so foolish as to say I don't agree with necessarily all of it like I do. I don't agree with almost all of it. There's a few points I'd be foolish to say I don't, that I wouldn't understand where are they coming from. I just think they handled it poorly and they went a little heavy-handed with it, clearly trying to make a money grab. The problem is they brought in these CEOs at Wizard of the Coast instead of creatives. This is what's happened at Disney as well. Modern corporations nowadays, some of these corporations just cannot get it together. Problem is they get rid of all the right brain creative people. They bring these left brain number of people, and nothing against left brain, right? I think I'm kind of even, actually. I always assumed I was mostly right brain, but I think I'm 50-50, actually. You need both types of people, right? But they have these left brain people trying to control right brain stuff, and they just don't don't get it, just like a lot of right brain people don't really get the financial stuff. So Wizards of the Coast did the same thing. Disney kind of, I think, has done some of that too. I think maybe they're starting to learn their lesson, maybe in some ways, finally. Uh, but anyway, Wizards of the Coast has brought in these Microsoft people, right, that are really good at microtransactions and all this kind of stuff, and they don't really get the actual gaming process, I think. Maybe a couple of them do. And it shows because they make this big kind of lawyer heavy OGL document that clearly they weren't really thinking deeply about some of the creators involved. Because some of these people, and not so much me, because again, I run Savage Kingdoms and straight D&D stuff. I don't create product for OGL, just to be clear. But a lot of the content creators out there do make a living, a partial living, maybe perhaps their whole living on crafting fifth edition stuff to sell on DM's Guild or to kickstart whatever it is. So understandably, they're very upset. So I wanted to offer different things to get away from Dungeons and Dragons. I've always kind of had a love-hate relationship with D&D, honestly. Mostly love, but some hate because the love part is it started in 1979, so a long time ago. Yeah, I'm ancient. Um, but I guess the flip side of being ancient is that I've learned lots of stuff, right? Particularly in D&D, I've seen all the editions, the rise and fall, satanic panic, blah blah blah, all this stuff. A lot of it's kind of overblown nowadays. It's romanticized. And Stranger Things and stuff. It's cool though. I mean, a lot of it, the core of all of this nostalgia of D&D is pretty accurate. The core of it, a lot of it gets kind of blown out. Like the satanic panic. Someone was asking me the other day, going, "Oh my God, how did you live through?" It's like it wasn't that bad. Come on, it's like it was just a game. It was a pretty obscure game back then. Um, but yes, there were church organizations, non-church organizations going after Dungeons and Dragons, thinking it was causing harm to young people in the world. And eventually, they kind of proved, that was bunk. Um, the famous case of the kid at Michigan State, I believe, or maybe it was University of Michigan, who went into the steam tunnels to pretend he was playing D&D down in dungeons and crypts and stuff like that. Turns out that was not true. He had other issues going on, and then they found him. So, yeah, weird. Just to give you an example. So I'm kind of bringing a lot of this sort of knowledge from a long time ago. I guess it's the good side of being around for a little while. So, yeah, the OGL thing goes back to 3.5, and now it's reared its ugly head again in 5 in 5e. So, um, and continuing it into one D&D, which is essentially going to be a 5.5, if not a full 6.0. They're just not calling it that, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be. It will be backward compatible to a degree, like they claim. I don't think it's going to be as much as they originally claimed it would be. They, as in Wizards of the Coast, but it will be to some degree. Then again, any version of D&D is backward compatible to a degree. You just have to do a little work on it. I think fourth edition was probably the anomaly, the one that was not the most like D&D, which is probably why it didn't do as well as they would have imagined. Um, so yeah. So yes, having all that been said, since there are other games out there beyond, and I know people have mentioned this before, and I guess I have in past videos. I don't honestly keep track of a lot of. I need to organize this channel better. In other words, so I don't always remember necessarily what I would to a small degree. I kind of remember the major stuff that I've talked about, but so there are alternatives to Dungeons and Dragons. This is a good time to play independent games, to try out independent RPGs. And I'm specifically talking about tabletop RPGs, the original RPG role playing game. So we'll talk about my little product for a little bit. I might make videos about other games too, because I don't want to seem like it's just like, oh, I'm taking advantage on the failure of Wizards of the Coast. Okay, I am sort of. But there are other game systems out there. Just to mention a few really quick before I just go into Savage Kingdoms really quick a little bit. Again, allowing me this chance. You've got things like Savage Worlds, right? Which some people conflict with my game or vice versa. Usually not, because that game is much huger. Savage Worlds. Um, People have asked, like, why did I name it Savage Kingdoms so close to that? So, I called it Savage Kingdoms before I realized it was Savage Worlds. So, even before I published Savage Kingdoms 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago, the first edition, I think Savage Worlds had still been it was around, but not only it was pretty new, I think. Um, I wasn't aware of the name. I even like did a Google search to see if I Savage like nothing came. So I don't whatever. Uh, and then by the time I did find out there was a Savage Worlds, the game was already like halfway written, and I even had the logo design. I think it was already designed at that point. And I was just like, you know what? It is what it is. You can't really coin the word savage. So yeah, it just was. It is what it is. Savage Kingdoms and Savage Worlds. Other games that you could try. That's I wouldn't call Savage Worlds indie exactly. It's got a pretty good following, but other good ones are Pendragon, which I've talked about. I think Pendragon is still around. It wasn't. It's like fourth, maybe it's sixth edition. Wow. Excuse me. That was a very unique game back in the 80s. I think it came out in 1985. It was really cool because it put a lot of emphasis on character traits, on actual role playing traits, and your other traits, your physical traits, are kind of secondary. I thought that was really cool. It like really, particularly speaking as like an actor, or, is that it awarded role playing more in a structured game mechanical sense instead of like, oh, here's a point of inspiration. So you were role playing these passions and these traits that are kind of known for those King Arthur, Arthurian type characters from literature. And you had your physical, you had your sword skill and your lance skill and that stuff like that. But it seemed to be your traits, your 13, I think is how many there were, identifying traits, were really controlled the destiny of your character and how you played it. And it didn't lock you necessarily in if you started not playing this one trait. It would lower, so you had this kind of cool rating system. Those of you who played it know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's probably super confusing. But some like if your character was known to be very energetic, the opposite of that spectrum is lazy. Is one trait. Another one was I think was courage, and then the opposite of that, of course, is cowardice or craven. And you could kind of float in between those two. So instead of having like an alignment scale, you had these 13 personality traits, and they could affect. You would roll. It was D20 and D6 system. Combine both of it's the only die types it used was D20s and D6s. Anyway, that was a good alternative Pendragon. It is based on somewhat historical Britain, but there are fantasy elements because you have the Fae or the fairy world, that kind of interconnected. And some of the base stuff of Pendragon actually has influenced Savage Kingdoms. A lot of my design with the other world occasionally touching the mortal world and stuff like that. So it's has a very Celtic kind of and somewhat Viking kind of feel to it. So that's a cool option. Call of Cthulhu, I would probably not really call it indie, but it kind of is in the fact, anything in the shadow of Dungeons and Dragons, I guess, is kind of almost indie. But you can make a case for Paizo, right? Because it's a fairly good sized company that produces Pathfinder. So yeah, Call of Cthulhu is really cool if you want gothic horror, Lovecraftian horror with the Cthulian creatures, the elder deities, elder gods, and all that kind of stuff is really kind of cool. Um, Personally, prefer playing in the 1920s era. I think it's really cool that you're being challenged on tech, but you still have something like you get a hold of a Tommy gun. That's awesome, but anybody who's played Call of Cthulhu, it doesn't really matter unless you're playing like at the Delta Green era, where you're as modern military guys that actually have some halfway decent military equipment. You don't really want to face a lot of these creatures head on anyway, right? So the whole point of it is you're investigating ways to defeat this cult or this horrible creature that's being risen out of the Atlantic or the Pacific and all that Lovecraftian stuff. How to kind of and if you find a grimoire with magical spells with sorcery in it, then yeah, you can try to learn those spells, but there's a horrible cost possibly to your humanity, to your soul. So if you like that kind of stuff, that's a good alternative. Another one I just touched on is Pathfinder. That's a pretty good big size game, but a lot of people probably have already headed towards Pathfinder 2.0. That's a pretty cool game. I kind of got away from it. I thought it was Pathfinder 1. I did play it for a while, as my group didn't like 4th edition very much, even though we tried 10 sessions. This is why I can kind of almost brag that some people are like, oh, I hated 4th edition. I skipped it entirely. So I didn't skip it entirely, at least tried it like 10 sessions, I think, our group. And we finally just looked at each other and we're like, this game is not connecting with any of us. I think if we were like World of Warcraft players, maybe so, because I think that's what the approach they were taking. But I think that was kind of foolish. I'm one of those people that I think if something secondarily is copying the primary thing that it was inspired by, I think you're almost always going in the wrong direction. So D&D was first, computer role playing was second. So don't try to make it the other way. You're going to fail. That's almost, that's kind of a life lesson in general. Not always the case, but often, most of the time. So Pathfinder, yeah, I kind of got away from that because it was kind of bloated, but I never hated it. But I've looked at 2.0. It looks pretty cool. At first I didn't like the 3-action system that everybody else seems to love. Coming mostly from a game design point of view, I thought 3 actions. If you win initiative, you suddenly got 3 actions, and your opponent has no way to respond to the reactions that come up even rarer, I think, in 2.0 Pathfinder. Not to get too much into the details here, but then as I look at it and play, I've played it a couple times, like not much. I realized that it's better than I thought. It's kind of what I was coming from Savage Kingdoms. I have a 2-action system, and those actions can count as anything. So D&D does this thing where you have action, move, and then maybe a bonus action if you can do it, which is not a bad system. I think most people like it. But over time, I think it's kind of broken apart, and it's kind of like 3.5 D&D was even worse, and 1.0 Pathfinder with the fact that you had like swift actions and standard action and move, and you had all these micro actions. So Pathfinder 2.0, I think, is just cleaned up, saying like, okay, anything that counts as an action, this is one action. Some actions, maybe if they're longer actions, they count as 2 actions or whatever. So in other words, they're just kind of breaking down into 3s. I tried to do the same thing in Savage Kingdoms, but instead of 3, because I thought that was a little too much, it's a 2-action system. So yeah, there's Pathfinder. Give you a couple more before I kind of go into Savage Kingdoms a little bit. I'm not going to go really far because we're only like 19 minutes into this thing. It was just going to be an overview. Some more. There's Fate, the Fate system or Fate core system. Now, a lot of people that know me as like an I teach improv. I do improv. It's just part of being an actor nowadays is learning improv technique and stuff. So a lot of people assume that, hey, Mike, you probably like the Fate system because it's very heavily based on improv. Excellent. Sounds cool. Let's try it. So I played it a few times and it's all right, but I wasn't as crazy. It's too loose. I found myself liking games that I like some crunch, right? I like some skeleton of the rules. I mean, it's probably why the Savage Kingdom's core rulebook is pretty thick, I have to admit. But this contains the entire game system plus all of the lore, the gazetteer of the world. It's got the whole thing in it, right? So if current D&D Fifth Edition put all of their books, it would be like that, right? Or it'd be even bigger. It'd be twice of what you can see in the frame there. So, and this book is just there. So maybe it's not as much as people might think. But it is, my point is I liked a little bit of half. So stuff like Fate is almost like not crunchy enough. And it's cool. It's pretty cool if you can use it. You have to play with a group that's pretty good at improv and they're willing to, and they're pretty creative and willing to accept. There are some, there's some players out there, we all know them and bless their hearts, but they're competitive when they play and they're also a little pushbacky, which is not very good improv technique. But if it's players that have never done improv and don't even know what you're talking about when you about no and not saying no and just accepting and building on top of stuff, blah blah blah. I prefer to game with people like that kind of know how to do that. If not, weren't taught it, just do it naturally. So I think Fate doesn't work well with competitive players that aren't willing to kind of buy into the game system a little bit. Probably true with tabletop role playing, and regardless of whatever system, but in particular this one. So yeah, but anyway, that is an option. Fate. There's Star Wars Age of Destiny, which is really cool. They use all the different funky dice. I have a couple friends that play it. It looks fascinating. I'm actually not one into all the different dice that are different colors and different symbols on them. I find it a little gimmicky personally, but it is kind of cool. I mean, it's still fascinating to watch. I need to play it a little bit more, but it seems to be pretty popular. So that seems to be a cool game. So this as well. You have Dungeon Crawl Classics, by the way. It's one of the what people would call an OSR game, an old school Renaissance. Um, so a little, I wouldn't say red flag. Disclaimer there is that DCC, it is kind of OSR, but it's its own thing. I remember the first time I played. I've only played a couple, 3 times maybe, at like a convention. I remember thinking, oh, it's going to be just like first edition D&D, where it's actually really kind of its own thing. It's actually quite different than early D&D. The feel of it and some of the hard coded rules are, but it has a lot of stuff that's added onto it. And a lot of it's pretty cool, like the way magic works and stuff like that. And there's more of a chance of your characters dying. I think you're kind of coached to build 2 or 3 characters and kind of have them ready. I think there's a vetting system where you send several of your characters out, and usually only 1 or 2 might make it out of the dungeon. I don't know why I'm doing this. Often it is actually a dungeon um, setting, so that's kind of cool. And there's other games that are similar, Dungeon Crawl to DCC as well, that are really cool. So yeah, all right. So a little bit last bit of the video here. I just wanted to. This is all a big setup to talk about Savage Kingdom's role playing game. This is another alternative. This is definitely an indie game in the highest degree. It's smaller than all those games I've mentioned by far. Um, so any chance I can kind of prop it up and try to get people a little more interested, maybe make a few more sales. It is available on Drive Through RPG. Those of you who watched my other videos, I've broken down all different parts of the rules and all the different races and um, callings you can do. Calling is basically just kind of Savage Kingdom's name for sort of a class. I don't call it a class though because classes are more restrictive. Callings in Savage Kingdoms, you don't even have to have one actually. uh, give you kind of a rough template and and maybe some extra equipment. That's about it. You can choose to not have a calling and you can build the character completely freeform. So it runs on a D20 system. That's one of these crazy things. I don't know why I'm having to show you guys, but there it is in case you're completely brand new to tabletop role-playing games and happen to stumble upon this channel by some random reason. But yeah, Savage Kingdoms. It is more. You could probably tell by the logo right there. It is more of a. There it is. immersive role-playing in a gritty world of Dark Ages fantasy. And then if you look at the actual logo, it says heroic sword and sorcery role-playing. So um, I'm both proud of that and also making fun of it at the same time. So originally, when the game was being developed, I was trying to. It was very Conan-esque, very sword and sorcery, very Hyborian Age-ish. Not exactly. It was my own world, of course, but it was very. And then over time, as I play tested it and play it, and it went through the editions, it became more Dark Ages. It became, in other words, it kind of. So what I'm getting at is like sword and sorcery is often set in kind of a age of antiquity, an age undreamed of that may or may not be kind of a part of our ancient world. And there are a couple of lands and kingdoms, particularly in Robert E. Howard's world of Conan, where it's becoming in the early Middle Ages. So Savage Kingdoms kind of fits in between that and then like your typical high Middle Ages of most tabletop role playing games, particularly Dungeons and Dragons. Savage Kingdoms kind of fits right in between. So that's why eventually I just my little blurb is a gritty world of Dark Ages fantasy. So there you go. So it's kind of a mix of dark fantasy and sword and sorcery. There's a little bit of high fantasy ish to it. I'm not a big fan of high fantasy other than Tolkien, but there is some Tolkienian high fantasy elements kind of in there as well. So it's kind of its own thing, really, over time. Um, but if you had to choose any of those subgenres, it would still probably be a little bit more sword and sorcery than anything else. There's also some historical elements, historical fantasy elements to it. And you might say historical fantasy, that's kind of a misnomer, weirdness. It's not actually. That's actually a legit subgenre of fantasy or subgenre of history. I'm a huge fan of historical fantasy, actually. So those who don't know what it is, it's like it could be stuff about King Arthur. If you watch The Last Kingdom on Netflix, it's based on a series of novels. That's also historical fantasy. It's like literally based on some characters mentioned in history. It actually follows from what we know of early England, of Dark Age England. Well, before it became England, the kingdoms that were in Britannica after the Romans, left it. And but then the fantasy elements are more like uh, there's a couple characters that weren't really history, and we just kind of made them up, or maybe this event happened that probably really didn't happen in history, or maybe it did. There's just no record of it. And then maybe there's even a few little magical elements to it that make it even more traditionally what we would call fantasy. So that's historical fantasy. Savage Kingdoms has a tad bit of that too, but again, mostly sword and sorcery. So why would you want to play Savage Kingdoms, right? So again, it's just a single D20 system. This is rolled for everything. The biggest question that comes up is uh, to use D&D terminology, how do you do to hit and damage or attack rolls and damage? Because in D&D you make this an attack roll or to hit roll, and then if you hit, meaning you successfully strike your opponent, then you roll damage dice, and they're usually different types of dice: D4, D10, D6. Sometimes it's multiple of those, depending if you're using a special ability from your character's class, or possibly even race. So I wanted to kind of get rid of all that because I felt like that kind of slowed the game down a little bit. It's like you do the thing, and now I got to do a whole different thing. And also because I remember describing combat, particularly if somebody you rolled like a 24 total, you're like, oh man, you just drive by this guy's defense and just jack him and then you roll damage. It's like, and 1 point of damage. So I did eventually learn just to hold off on the description until after the damage roll. But again, it seems like this like break in the action. So my goal with Savage Kingdoms was to make everything off the D20. So the way it works, and to go back to the attack roll scenario, say you roll so basically you roll a D20, you add a number, positive, well, not always positive, but usually a positive modifier. You're adding an attribute plus your skill levels. We can go up to skill level 10 in Savage Kingdoms 3rd edition. Previous editions, you could go up to 12, but everything's been kind of streamlined now. So 10 would be back then actually like level 13. So in some ways, you actually even have slightly higher, more degrees of skill levels in the new system than in the old, believe it or not. And then you might add a miscellaneous modifier, depending on your race or culture, or maybe some special talent that your character has, right? So all that just totals up to a bonus to the die roll. Usually, it could be a negative. You're really terrible at that particular ability. add it to the die roll, just like in D&D. So say if I rolled a 12, and I have, say, a +5 modifier in that skill I was rolling. Say I'm making acrobatics roll, which is based on agility. Agility is one of the 6 attributes of Savage Kingdoms. I'm trying to hit a DL, a difficulty level number, a target number, right? D&D calls it DC, difficulty class. I'm just trying to hit a target number, right? So we'll say in this case, I needed a 20, I rolled a 12, plus 5 is 17. I missed it by 3. If it were an acrobatic, there's rules about acrobatics in the book, but in general, if you miss by 3, you don't, if it's a jump, if I can remember, you don't fail entirely. If you're within 3, you get a chance to like grab the edge of something if you were trying to jump, or maybe you lose your balance or something like that. DL20 is pretty difficult. That's like what did I rate it? Moderate difficulty is 15, so 20 I think is what I call tough or hard, and like the chart. But if say it was a moderate difficulty thing, DC, and I rolled a 12 plus 5, 17, you succeeded. Say the next thing is you're stabbing someone with a dagger, and let's say you have a +4 modifier, and you roll a 4. 4 plus 4, right? 8. So an 8, probably in almost most scenarios, you're going to miss your target. But let's say you attack again with that dagger, and you roll an 18, and again, you have a +4 skill bonus, and that 22 is your total. And the opponent's defense was 16. That you scored 6 above 16, right? That's 6 points of damage. That's how damage is figured in Savage Kingdoms. Very simple. Some weapons, particularly big, heavy weapons, have what's called armor piercing. Basically, it's just bonus damage. Let's say you hit someone with a great axe for 6 base points of damage. Great axe has an armor piercing rating of 3, so you would do 9 points of damage. And then each weapon has a maximum damage rating. A dagger, for example, to go back to our first example there, maximum damage is 10 for just a normal average quality dagger. Great axe is 30 maximum damage. So you can, the average person, the average NPC has 10 or 11 health points. So if you roll really high with a great axe, you can completely obliterate someone in one blow, which is pretty realistic. That's actually what would happen. Rolling anything lower than that means you're just glancing some of the axe, which generally means they're kind of spinning off with it. Their armor is taking it, but still armor piercing 3, meaning that even a nick from a great axe, as you can imagine in real life, would still cause a pretty bad wound for the most part. So that's kind of how that basic system works with the D20. Just using a combat example. The rules continue to work on the same thing. There are certain things that work. So D&D has something called saving throws, right? So in Savage Kingdoms, we have resistance rolls, which are basically saving throws. I'm just not calling them saving throws because it's kind of an old coin phrase. It's also kind of old vernacular. It doesn't really make as much sense anymore. Like intuitively, like, what is this saving throw? And what it originally meant was it's a chance to save you from a horrible effect, right? And so that nomenclature has just kind of remained into 5th edition D&D. I prefer to call it like a resistance roll. In fact, when I'm teaching new gamers how to play D&D, when I tell them what saving throws are, I almost always say it's to resist. It's when you're resisting something. So using that natural language is why I call them resistance rolls in Savage Kingdom. So that would be Savage Kingdoms. So say if you are a dragon is breathing its breath. Yes, there are dragons in Savage Kingdoms, although they're quite rare but pretty nasty. We'll say it's an ice dragon, breathes its icy breath on you. You would need an acrobatics roll to dodge, and we'll say it's a young adult dragon. It's probably DL. I think it's DL 22. You have to roll. So say you roll acrobatics to try to get out of the way. You roll a 2, and we'll say you're +3 in it, so a 5. You failed the roll by, what is that? 22 and 5. What is that? 17. You would take 17 points of cold damage. If it's an older dragon, it's 2 points of damage per point of failure on that roll. That would be like 34 points. You would probably completely be obliterated completely. The max damage, I think, would be 30 for that type of dragon, maybe 35. So, yeah, it would probably kill most people. So the good thing is there is a mechanic in Savage Kingdoms called luck. You have a certain amount of luck points you start with. And they don't replenish every session like some games do. I looked at doing that. This is pretty heavily play tested, but I like the fact that we ended up doing where you just have the bit and what it represents. If you get down to zero eventually, and some of my in-person players that we've played this campaign for about a year and a half to 2 years, they're down to zero. One or two of them might have one or 2 points of luck, but there's a couple characters I know that are down to zero luck. And it represents the fact that your luck is running thin. You know, you hear these terminologies and literature and stuff like that, and it literally kind of represents that. It's also really cool too because you can make something on a luck roll, and it's a d20 plus your current luck. So it's a mechanic for the dungeon master to, or game master actually in this case, to go. No, there's. I need them to make a roll for something, but it's not a skill thing. It would be something like it's come up a few times. Oh, I meant to bring my that cloak that I picked up, and I just I'll make a luck roll to see if you happen to be. Or actually, a better example would be like another character got attacked. They were separated. And they went down an alleyway inside of a city, and he was looking for like some shady merchant, and he got a thief tried to pick his pocket or something. He was in a shady part of town, and a skirmish breaks out. And another character was like, "Oh man, can I help out?" And well, you were somewhere else, but since we didn't specifically say where you were, make a luck roll. Uh, Deal 15 or higher. If you get a 15 or better, you happen to be in that area, and you can hear this skirmish going on, and maybe you can come help if you want. So it's to determine stuff like that. It's actually been pretty useful. What else can I say about the game without going too much longer since we're at 36 minutes? Yeah, it uses D20. It's an indie game. This is the second book in the third edition line. So you can see the logo at the top. This is the cool piece of art. This is from Michael Scott Phillips, my graphic designer. As you can see, it's not quite as thick as the core rule book. This is a secondary book, but as you can see, it's called The Savage East, and it covers the eastern part of the world. So the core rule book that I showed you, the cool kind of gray and black with a little bit of red and gold on it, covers the kind of the continent of Astagonia, which is kind of a European-esque continent, ranging anywhere from kind of Scandinavian type cultures all the way down to ancient Greek type cultures in the Pridonian Islands. And then the Savage East covers Mezca, which is kind of a Aztec-esque kind of central isle continent right on the equator of the world. This world has two moons, by the way, and a red sun, a red giant as a sun. And then it covers the continent of Hassan and Imanju, which is kind of like an Asian type or Asiatic sort of continent and an African-inspired continent. And there's also a polar continent called Ragnagard or Rathkir, depending on. There's an obscure race of I guess icemen that live up there called the Rathkiri. So they actually call it Rathkir, but humans typically call it, the northern humans particularly call it Ragnagard. So anyway, the Savage East covers those non-Astagonian parts of the world. So very cool to kind of expand upon. So not only gazetteer-wise did it expand the world, but there's also a few rules additions. There's new talents, new spells, in addition to what's in the core rule book. A couple of new weaknesses. Weaknesses are a cool thing you can take as your character. It gives you bonus points when you're creating a character to spend for talents and skills. But role playing wise, it gives you these cool like kind of weaknesses and these drawbacks that you can role play. And some of them are most of them are hard coded too. Like they do have a penalty with certain dice rolls. A lot of it's really kind of up to the game master to bring in, but also the really good role players. I'm pretty blessed to have some really good role players in my group. They will almost always role play those weaknesses without me having to prompt them because it's kind of coded into the character's personality at that point, especially after they've played these characters for 35, 40 sessions. They just are kind of part of them now, so it's kind of cool to watch that. So yeah, so in general, Savage Kingdom is another indie game that you can do. Pick it up at Drive Through RPG. Both books are for sale there. You can get hard copies or PDF. If you happen to live in Western North Carolina, the books are for sale at the Wyvern's Tail Game Store, kind of my home game shop here in in Asheville, so in North Carolina, so in Western North Carolina, in the mountains here. But well, thanks for listening, everyone. I think I'm going to end it there. This actually went a little longer than I imagined, like it usually does. Pick up Savage Kingdoms. Check out other non D&D stuff during this kind of whole OGL thing. So, otherwise, talk to you guys again soon. Thanks for watching.